to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the July 17, 2019 edition of Space News. And good evening, space fans. This is Tina Stagg from the Space Association of Australia, and I'm on my own this week, just like Sandra Bullock in Gravity, except with a much firmer grasp of orbital mechanics. So let's get started with the big story from last week in US space policy news. NASA shook up the leadership of its exploration program last week, reassigning two top officials. In a memo, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said that Bill Gerstenmaier, Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, and Bill Hill, Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration Systems Development, had been reassigned to Special Advisor positions. Former shuttle astronaut Ken Bowersox, Gerstenmaier's deputy, was named to replace Gerstenmaier on an acting basis. Bridenstine's memo didn't explain why he removed Gerstenmaier and Hill from their posts, other than that the changes were part of efforts to return humans to the moon by 2024. Bridenstine said in a later memo that the agency would conduct a nationwide search to find a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, as well as two deputies. In other international news, and looking at Russia, a Russian and European all-sky survey satellite is safely in space following a successful launch on a Proton rocket at the weekend. The Spectre RG mission is a joint project between the Russian space agency Roscosmos and the German space agency DLR. Spectre RG launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan after weeks of delays. Spectre RG will next navigate to a stable orbit in space called a Lagrange point, specifically L2, where the gravitational forces of two large objects, in this case the Sun and the Earth, balance each other out. The spacecraft is expected to detect 100,000 galaxy clusters, 3 million supermassive black holes, tens of thousands of star-forming galaxies, the presence of plasma, and many more types of objects, according to Roscosmos. In other Russian news, Russia carried out a previously unannounced Soyuz launch of 4 military satellites last week. The Soyuz 2.1V rocket, a version of the Soyuz rocket without any strap-on boosters, lifted off from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. Russia didn't announce the launch in advance and didn't disclose the purpose of the 4 satellites placed into sun-synchronous orbits. To the United Arab Emirates, a Vega rocket carrying an Emirati satellite failed minutes after liftoff last week. The rocket lifted off from Kourou, French Guiana, after several days of delays because of high-altitude winds. About 2 minutes after liftoff, the rocket deviated from its planned trajectory and fell back to Earth. Arianespace said a major malfunction took place around the time of ignition of the rocket's solid fuel second stage, but provided no other details on the cause of the launch failure, the first in 15 launches of the Vega. The rocket was carrying the Falcon I-1 imaging satellite for the United Arab Emirates. Arianespace and ESA have convened a commission to investigate the failed launch. Japan's Hayabusa 2 spacecraft successfully touched down on the asteroid Ryugu last week. The spacecraft made a touch-and-go manoeuvre on the surface. Hayabusa 2 touched down in a crater formed by an impactor released from the spacecraft earlier this year, gathering material exposed by that impact for later return to Earth. A German company developing a lunar lander has filed for bankruptcy protection. Berlin-based PT Scientists announced last week it had filed for a preliminary insolvency under the German Insolvency Code with a local court. PT Scientists, a former Google Lunar X Prize team, says it will continue work on its first lunar lander while insolvency proceedings continue. In Israel, Firefly is partnering with Israel Aerospace Industries on a commercial lunar lander. The companies announced last week that Firefly will build a lander called Genesis based on the design of the Beresheet lander for SpaceIL built by Israel Aerospace Industries. Firefly will build Genesis in the US and offer it to NASA through the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. Poland. A Polish startup has placed its first 2 small sats into orbit. Sat Revolution successfully deployed its first 2 nanosats into orbit from the International Space Station on July 3. The company says the development, carried out by NanoRacks, marks the beginning of its initiative to place some 1,024 nanosats into orbit by 2026 as part of its real-time Earth observation constellation project. The company says that constellation will ultimately be able to image the Earth in close to real time. In commercial news and SpaceX. SpaceX has won a contract to launch a small NASA mission originally designed to go on a much smaller rocket. NASA announced last week it will launch its imaging X-ray polarimetry explorer on a Falcon 9 in April 2021 at a cost of $50.3 million. That price, lower than other recent NASA launch contracts with SpaceX, is enabled by the use of a previously flown first stage. IXPE, which weighs only about 300 kilograms, was designed originally to launch on a Pegasus XL, but the cost of the Falcon 9 contract is less than what NASA paid several years ago for its latest Pegasus launch. A small fire broke out last week at the Florida site where SpaceX is building a prototype of its Starship vehicle. The fire was limited to a shipping container and nearby building at the Florida facility and did not involve the vehicle itself. Local officials estimated the damage at between $50,000 and $100,000. The site is one of 2 where SpaceX is working on prototypes of Starship, its next-generation launch vehicle. To Virgin. Virgin Galactic expects to be profitable as soon as 2021, thanks to a merger that will take the company public. The company will get $800 million in capital from its merger with social capital Hedosophia, a special purpose acquisition company, with the merged company publicly traded. Virgin Galactic CEO George Whitesides said the merger was a more efficient way of going public than a traditional initial public offering. Social capital Hedosophia Holdings Corp will take a 49% stake in Virgin Galactic in a deal that values the company at $1.5 billion. Virgin Orbit performed a successful drop test of its Launcher 1 rocket last week. A full-sized but inert version of the rocket was released from the company's Boeing 747 carrier aircraft to test the dynamics of the release process. The rocket fell to the ground at Edwards Air Force Base in California as planned. The company said the test wrapped up the flight test program for the aircraft. Virgin Orbit plans to perform the first orbital launch of the air-launched Launcher 1 rocket later on this year. The Planetary Society is holding off on deploying a solar sail on a new satellite while it performs an additional test. The organisation said last week that engineers decided to conduct additional tests of the LightSail 2 spacecraft and possibly update its flight control software before attempting to deploy its solar sail. That deployment is now scheduled for no earlier than July 21st. LightSail 2 launched on a Falcon Heavy mission last month and was released from another satellite recently. And finally, NASA is tweaking the operation of its Voyager spacecraft to get additional life out of them. The 2 spacecraft, which have crossed into interstellar space, are still operating, but their power levels are dropping as their nuclear power sources decay. To conserve power, controllers recently turned off a heater for one instrument on Voyager 2 and found that instrument continues to work even though it's now at a lower temperature than what it was tested to operate under. NASA hopes to keep the spacecraft operating well into the 2020s, so its measurements of conditions at the boundary of interstellar space can complement a mission scheduled for launch in 2024. That's it for the week. Back to Andrew.